It's been very erratic, but it does tend to lean back towards Donald Trump putting pressure on the Ukrainians and accepting that Russia seems to have, as he thinks, legitimate demands on Ukraine over the Donbass and Crimea. And this is the kind of thing that he's been saying way back since 2016.
Now, as Ukraine's third Christmas at war with Putin's Russia draws close, simply surviving this long as a country seems like a miracle. Today, the leaders of France and Germany have been sitting alongside Keir Starmer, gathered together with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky in Downing Street, pondering how to bring about another miracle, a just end to the war that respects Ukrainian territory and sovereignty and denies Putin the conquest that he wants. How, though? I'll have the latest for you on that meeting at number 10 in just a moment. And is President Trump the leader most capable of tilting the balance of the war back to blaming Zelensky for keeping the war going and not Putin? Trump's son, Don Jr., suggested that his father may wash his hands of the search for peace and walk away. Would he? And if he did, many believe Trump wants to do that if he can't claim the credit for any peace and a Nobel Prize to go with it. If Trump did walk away, what would be the leaders in Downing Street's view now? What would they do? What would Ukraine's other friends do? And what would you be saying if you were sitting at that Downing Street table? Do tell me. Send me a text, 87222. Start with the word Times, or a tweet to @TimesRadio. Well, let's look at what's been going on. Keir Starmer hosting the meeting with the French President, the German Chancellor and Volodymyr Zelensky in Downing Street. Europe increasingly left out of the peace process for Ukraine. Chancellor Merz was frank about his unease about the talks between America and Russia ahead of the meeting.
Nobody should doubt on our support for Ukraine. Firmly standing behind, and the outcome is open. I'm skeptical about some of the details which we are seeing in the documents coming from the US side, but we have to talk about that. That's why we are here.
That's Chancellor Merz of Germany. So let's first get the thoughts of Maxim Tucker, the Times Ukraine correspondent. Hi to you, Maxim.
Hello, John.
Well, so this, Maxim, was a pretty high-profile meeting. Any idea of what the outcome might have been? Was there anything that could be called an outcome?
Well, we're not seeing one yet, but I think this is a largely symbolic meeting. We've tended to see these kind of European leaders' meetings rallying around Zelensky when he faces a lot of pressure from Donald Trump and the US administration to accept an unfavourable peace deal. There are a few things that the Ukraine's allies could do while waiting for the US. They can obviously step up their rearmament. They can step up the amount of arms that they're sharing with Ukraine. They could even kind of put fighter jets in the sky over Western Ukraine. But we've seen a real reluctance to do that. And so far, it's just words. And I think that's going to be frustrating for Zelensky, although, of course, he appreciates the defense from the pressure of Donald Trump.
Indeed. Now, we can assume also that those leaders in Downing Street, Maxim, were puzzling, worrying about President Trump's commitment to the cause of Ukraine. It's always been so uncertain and has been so erratic.
It's been very erratic, but it does tend to lean back towards Donald Trump putting pressure on the Ukrainians and accepting that Russia seems to have, as he thinks, legitimate demands on Ukraine over the Donbass and Crimea. And this is the kind of thing that he's been saying way back since 2016. So, I think it's very worrying for European leaders that they might see the US withdrawn entirely from this peace process. And I think what's really difficult for Ukraine and what's really difficult for Europe is that there's no way to replace this US intelligence sharing. The satellites that the US has in the air over Ukraine are really indispensable. And I think all of the kind of European participation going along with these Trump talks and Ukraine's participation in these negotiations with Russia, which don't really seem to be going anywhere, are aimed at keeping that intelligence sharing going.
And of course, Maxim, if Donald Trump were to walk away, that would be the ultimate challenge, wouldn't it, to the commitment of the European leaders and Ukraine's other friends?
Yeah, Donald Trump, I think, would like to wash his hands of it. He's got great business interests in Russia. His children have business interests in Russia. Steve Witkoff has business interests with the Russians. I think it would do him a great deal of favor if he could lift sanctions and be done with this. But he still has to deal with some of those Republicans, people within his own party who have been staunch defenders of Ukraine, even Marco Rubio, who has a different view on Ukraine to others in the Trump administration. So it isn't so easy for Donald Trump to wash his hands of this yet.
No, I suppose rather worrying for those who are keen to just follow the cause of Ukraine to see that American policy document at the weekend, which did look like an ambition to decouple America from those historic obligations. But Maxim Tucker, good to talk to you. Now, I can now say good afternoon to Tobias Kramer, who's a former German diplomat and an MEP on committees for relations with NATO and the United States. Tobias, welcome to you.
Europe increasingly was on the menu when we looked at the negotiations between the United States and Russia. And I think what Chancellor Merz, along with Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, really want to do is to reclaim Europe's place at the table, because we all know that if you aren't at the table, it will be problematic. And we see we can't rely on the Americans doing the heavy lifting for us. We have to do that ourselves. But I think we only get there if we finally use the levers we have, ranging from Russian frozen assets over sanctions towards really ensuring that we have the hard power we need to defend ourselves. And I think this is what the coalition of the willing has to implement.
Yes, I mean, as far as funding Ukraine, the European Union does seem to be a good deal closer now to possibly handing over, effectively, an unrepayable loan to Ukraine of maybe 90 billion euros or more, underpinned by Russian frozen assets. That would be an enormous help. But if President Trump were to walk away from this, as many people think he would quite like to do, Tobias, that would put an even greater burden on Germany and Ukraine's other friends to step up and fill the breach.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I still hope that we can keep the Americans on board. But I think we have to understand that we in Europe, if we want a just and durable peace in Europe, we need to take a European initiative, and we need to be strong in Europe with these things. And I think using the frozen assets in a legal way, which is what the European Union is now intending to do, can be very, very strong in this context, because it will show on the one hand that we are willing to use the levers we have, and it's a very powerful lever, not only because it will allow the Ukrainians to be sure and signal to them that they can defend themselves for the next couple of years, but that can actually also change Putin's calculus. And I think this is really where we have to get at. For the time being, Putin keeps thinking that time is on his side, that over time he might win. And I think what we really have to get to is changing that calculus. Only then will he negotiate. And if we start using the frozen assets, as I said, we support Ukraine. He will know that Ukraine won't falter in the next couple of years because they're financed. But perhaps even more importantly, it puts an incentive for him to end the war, because the longer Putin prolongs this now, he's not only using the lives of soldiers, whom unfortunately he doesn't seem to care much about, but he's also losing more and more money, which he does seem to care more about.
Right. So look, it looks as if for financial help, a lot of it may be on its way to Ukraine. What sort of military support, further military support, could European friends of Ukraine, including Germany, do if that became necessary? Talking to a Times colleague there, he was talking about, well, just the possibility of NATO aircraft taking to the sky over Western Ukraine. That's not necessarily boots on the ground, but NATO aircraft in the air over Ukraine. Is that a conceivable course?
I mean, all these things are options that will need to be debated, but they all depend. Their feasibility would depend on the context of the ceasefire. What sort of ceasefire we would achieve? What sort of peace negotiations we would then have? What role the United States would play? What role the European Union would play? What role NATO would play? Yeah. But for all of that, we need a ceasefire. And the problem is, at the moment, all the negotiations that have been attempted from a position of weakness, from a position of appeasement, have failed. So I think what we first of all need to understand is that the only way to get Putin to real negotiations will to put ourselves in a position of strength. So I want to get to the ceasefire, and then we can see how we move onwards from there. And I think to get there, we need to strengthen Ukraine financially, but really also militarily, to the extent that we give them the means necessary to defend themselves.
Right. Now, all the meetings and talks about a so-called coalition of the willing of European and other countries ready to overlook a ceasefire when and if one comes about, they all seem to suppose that there'll have to be a ceasefire, and then these troops then become deployable. But Putin and his team at the Kremlin say no, they will not tolerate NATO member countries' troops on Ukrainian soil. How do you deal with that? It sounds like a veto for Putin.
Well, that is the whole problem. Putin is currently not willing to negotiate. And that is what negotiations will be about. At the moment, there is no Venn diagram of where people agree on. There are things that the Ukrainians can't accept, and there are things that the Russians are unwilling to accept.
Yeah.
And I think the only way to come together, the Ukrainians have already made a lot of compromises. From Russia, all we see are more wish lists to Santa Claus, really. They remain with all their maximalist positions.
Yeah.
And the only way that we can get them to compromise, that we actually find some common ground, I think will be by putting them under pressure first. So in some ways, it feels like wishful thinking to talk about these guarantees before we actually put the pressure on Russia to start negotiating.
Yeah, but could the coalition of the willing deploy forces against the wishes of Putin? Is that conceivable?
I mean, it would fully depend on the setup of the of the ceasefire. I mean, this is such a level of speculation. In the end, it's not dependent. It's not for Putin to decide what Europeans and Ukrainians do. This is how international law works. It does not depend on Putin. But in the negotiations, this will be one of the questions that will be on the table. Do we get a point where Putin might accept it, or do we get a point where we have to do something with the Ukrainians that Putin might not like? These are all questions but this is so far out there. We are talking about step 4 and 5 before we even talk about step 1. And unfortunately, all we are seeing is that Putin does not want to negotiate. He's making literally fun of the Americans. He's doing his, it's like Groundhog Day. We are seeing the same thing again and again. And the only way to change this vicious circle that keeps happening again and again is to finally, for us Europeans, to get into the initiative. We need to put something on the table, and then we can negotiate about that, but only from a position of strength. And at the moment, unfortunately, we are not there because we still keep hoping that the Americans are going to do it for us. And spoiler alert, I'm afraid that European security will only achieved by Europeans in the lead.
All right. Tobias Kramer, a member of the European Parliament and a former German diplomat. Thank you.